Welcome to the Heart of Soul podcast, an exploration of who you are, what you are, and why you are, offering new ways to investigate age-old questions at the heart of you. Hi, it's Joseph, and thanks for listening to the Heart of Soul podcast. Today, the most fundamental metaphysics of Edenity, how they relate to the three primary soul fears, and a one-pager that sums up over 100 podcast episodes. Fair warning, we're referring to a chart that I've included in the YouTube version, that's the video, so if you're in audio-only mode at the moment, you may want to go to YouTube, but that's up to you. I can make it work either way. Whether you can or not, that depends on you. Thanks so much for listening, or if you're on YouTube, for watching. Greetings and welcome forward. Now, for Stace, here's an interesting reality thing. For Stace and I, we're doing back-to-back recordings. We did this yesterday. But for you listeners, a week has passed already. So which is the real reality? I love thinking about that kind of stuff, which both realities are true and also neither. And it depends on where you are. And what's the objective reality of that? Is it back to back? There's only our perspective and the listener's perspective. Well, I guess it's objectively true that we recorded them back to back.
Yes.
In essence, but in expression, they can only be experienced by other people in a week apart.
So depending on the framework, you have two different answers.
Yeah. Yeah.
It reminds me of the Schrodinger's cat paradox.
It's the damn
right?
cat thing.
It's a mental gymnastic thing because the objective reality depends on who the participant is.
Yes. Does the podcast exist? Well, that's sort of a Zen question, right? Does it exist until someone listens to it?
Well, the recording of it, if we didn't record it, I couldn't really say it, except that it got etched in the archives somehow.
Yeah.
in the Akashika.
Like unilistically, but not dualistically, it would exist.
You go. Uh-huh. Yeah, exactly right. The recording dualizes it, so dualizes it. Yeah.
Yes. And little did you know, listener, that you were participating in this vast web of complicated, heavily metaphysicalized reality dharma. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. It's a chart that looks to me, we literally just came up with this about 20 minutes ago, what to talk about today. That's the problem with doing back-to-back podcasts. We had some catching up to do. It was like, normally we have days to simmer and let the new thing come up. And Stace and I were both scrambling. We almost didn't do it. So this was kind of an audible.
That's good, yeah. Uh-huh.
And I had a couple ideas, and Stace come up with the homeopathic emotive maturation chart, and I'm going to be putting this chart in the YouTube video. There will be a visual aid. It will be far, far easier to follow if you're looking at it. But if you want to do all audio, well, then you will endure those consequences. That is up to you.
Yeah, it's a good point here to make in that dimension is that I recently just get a ballpark figure of how many pages of words I have in all of the books that I've written, all 8 of them. And it's between 2,800 and,
20,000.
300 per 3,000. Yeah, 2,800 and 3,000 pages about.
Oh, pages. I thought you were going to say words.
Pages.
Wow, yeah,
no,
3,000 pages. Wow.
So this chart that Joseph's going to have on the YouTube version is really takes the place of almost 3,000 pages of words to explain. So
yeah, this zooms way out. All 3 hoods on one page. If Edenity had a brochure,
that's right.
Which it probably never will, this would be it.
Yeah, and so you really isn't. I would say I invite you to consider that it wouldn't be worth it to try to follow this without doing the visual, the video.
Yeah,
of
it's
this
too much work for your head. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so if you're looking at it now, everyone, I hope you have switched over. We're addressing as Joseph just said, in the most zoomed out way, the dharmas, the structural skeletal frameworks of the 3 dharmas that address the 3 unconscious terrors of soul birth. In other words, That begs for a little bit of unfolding there.
Mm-hmm.
When we were first soul born, there were three terrors that unfolded, and the order is less important than it might seem. But in other words, I could frame it this a couple different ways, and I really labored over that way back when. But the three unconscious, when we're soul born, literally we come out of divinity. And the best metaphor I could ever come up with, I think we talked about this years ago, Joseph, you can remind me. It's like if the sun is the center of a tableau, let's say. And the sun is the presence of divine being, which can have no border, but we'll use this metaphor. It looks like the sun is falling away from us, that we're falling away from it. It's getting a little smaller as we are birthed out of it into another version of divine being. But we can't really register that as we're being born out of source being. So you can't be birthed out of divine being, but it feels like it relative to the distancing from source being to self being, as the source births the self soul, the self-identified soul, which is immutable. The soul I is immutable. So the first soul fear that arises is the terror of being. In other words, all of a sudden there's source being, and here we are as soul I being. And what are we? Who are we if we are not incorporated inside of source being? But we are incorporated in source being, but our perception, just like our introduction here, depends on the framework.
Right.
From our point of view, we're falling out of source being, but into a form of divine being, until we hit our expressions of our soul I in our different dimensions of consciousness.
And interestingly, this is why, from Edenity's perspective, why we would say there are so many traditions, most notably Christianity, that has some kind of fall from grace kind of thing. We would say that this information is in the collective unconscious, or exists as a soul wound. There's some fall, we're out of something, things were better, we have to get back to something. That whole feeling you can see in many different paradigms, and it's mythologized and symbolized. Symbolicized is better than symbolized.
Better, I like it.
Sentence.
Yes. Yeah, so inside that context, we are falling away, but not out of heaven, not out of source being.
And that's an enormously important paradigmatic principle that would collapse all of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism right there. The idea that this is not God here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The big three would just be collapsed to dust with this one statement.
Yeah.
There's a beautiful example, isn't it, Joseph, of paradigmatic thinking? That's as clear as we could get as an example of paradigmatic thinking.
Because if you're outside of God, then lots of things, especially the solution path, is going to look wholly different from you were still inside of God. It just doesn't feel like it.
Right.
That's like you're in Boston and and you're trying to get to Texas versus you're in Texas and you're trying to get to Texas. It's like a really different, but you don't realize you're in Texas. It's a very different algorithm.
Right. And so this actually, I haven't thought of this in years, but with a fresh kind of take on this in the present moment, this is the fundamental premise of Edenity.
Yeah.
I never really would have said that in the past, but without this, nothing else makes sense.
Yeah. That
there is no fall out of God possible, and it's so simple. I mean, it's you can't make up. I mean, I don't understand how the dots could not have been connected in the past.
Yeah.
I mean, I can understand in my head, I guess, but if God is God, then nothing is outside of God.
And it's
right?
that's probably the sharpest distinction between esoteric spirituality and exoteric spirituality, because I think there are probably a lot of esoteric spiritualities that aren't as sophisticated as Edenity, but they would agree that we're still inside of God. They maybe
Yes,
don't have a
but
very good explanation of how that could be, how that works, and what to do about it. But they don't have
exactly.
this very black and white, good and bad, you've fallen from God, and because you're bad and you're being punished and you have to get back into these very fairy tale exoteric things.
Yeah. In other words, we never left heaven.
Mm-hmm.
This is another way of framing this. That there's no way out of heaven, and the only question then becomes, in terms of consciousness maturation, is why don't we experience that,
Yes.
right?
Right.
And the reason we don't experience it is because of these three knots, you could say, three knots in our soul consciousness from soul birth. The first one, as we just said, is the terror of being, quote unquote, from our point of view, separate from source being. So who am I if I'm not inside of source being? Well, the joke is you're always inside of source being, as we say a third, fourth time here, but we don't feel that. So there's a contraction that takes place in the soul that we would call the first soul fear, and that is the terror of being.
And related
Now
to
we
this,
keep
if you want to have some fun with, well, just about anybody, but especially a religious person, one of my favorite questions is, so in your paradigm, God is in all places at all times, everywhere, right? And they'll say, yeah. And I say, so why don't you experience that? Or
yes,
do you experience that? Like, is that
yes,
actually your experience? Just like, during the day, sunlight is in all
yeah,
places,
right,
and that's,
right,
so do you experience that? And if so, why not? Like, there's this
yeah,
short circuiting thing that happens because
yeah.
there's a sort of accountability of, it's
hmm
kind of an embodiment accountability. And what explanation do
Yeah.
they have for why that's not experienceable? Usually they don't have a very good one.
No, in fact, the one that worked for me in the past is hell is inside of God too, right?
Oh, that's, yes, right.
And that one really puts the fine point on it.
Yeah.
And then one person said, "Well, if God is God, I remember this question: if God is God and hell is inside of God, then God is also inside of hell, right?" There's no seam possible in divine source being. It
Yeah.
just has forms and expressions, but no walls
Right.
between its essence, form, and expression.
Similar to the idea that there's more God in a certain building with a pointy steeple
Yes.
on it as opposed to, the McDonald's next door or whatever.
Yeah, that the tragedy of the ages is Jerusalem, right?
Yes.
Three
Yeah.
major religions fighting over dirt. Dirt. It's just well,
Yes. Well, that real estate
it's
has a lot of God in it, on
oh,
it. Did they test that? The property
oh.
values just skyrocket when you've got more God in your dirt than the dirt next door.
No, yeah, and we're joking because in one way it is rather indefensibly hilarious.
Yeah.
In one way, it's all the projections we put on that dirt.
Right.
The human collective consciousness is powerful, so it can endow dirt with a bit of energetic juice, and
Yeah.
then that juice we interpret as coming from the dirt instead of though our projection on the dirt. See,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and so it's a really tricky one to needle it out,
Mm-hmm.
scalpel it out.
Mm-hmm.
What's projection and what's actually juice? Now there are such thing as vortexes where the Earth, kind of vents its own chakral system that you can actually perceive. A good third eye person can perceive those, but this is different. This,
But that's a really interesting distinction that I've not heard us talk about before. That idea that, like, a holy place or a spiritual place, there's truth, but it's a more superficial truth than the deeper
yes.
truth that everything is experienceable as just as holy as everything else.
Oh, nice. Right. A beautiful example of everything's real, but some things are more
Yeah,
real than
yeah, yeah, yeah,
others.
yeah.
Right.
So the church
Yeah.
does have a vibe you can feel in it that's
Yeah.
better than the McDonald's. In some
Yes.
ways. In some ways, it's going to be worse depending on how you pick it up. Remember that place we went to in France, that haunted monastery
Oh God.
place?
Yes. Yes. Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
I would have rather been to McDonald's than that place.
Well, if we take our metaphor just one step further, if you turn it around the other way, for me, and this is no criticism whatsoever, it's just religious dogma of the big three is fast food, uh,
Yeah,
from my
yeah.
point of view.
Yeah, I mean, you can
Uh,
tune into the energies of all sorts of places, but
yeah,
yeah, I mean, I would
yeah.
say that most churches are cleaner than the average Walmart,
I'd
energetically.
go with that. I'd
Yeah,
go with that
but
for
that doesn't
sure.
mean they're intrinsically super holy. And I've had plenty of divine experiences. I don't go to Walmart very often, but I've had a lot of deep spiritual experiences in Costco. But they're not a
Costco, yeah,
nonprofit
different.
church.
That's different.
It's more,
No. Well, with all the cosplay is going, the costume play that's going on in WalMarts too, people actually dress up to go to Walmart, hoping they get online somewhere from a photographer wearing
what?
ridiculously. Oh, Joseph, put in images Walmart costuming, or Walmart clothing, and you'll see they've lots of websites have people in Batman outfit going to Walmart, or women wearing virtually just crazy, almost naked stuff. It's nuts. It's just crazy stuff. Next time I see one on the internet, I'll send it to you. It's really crazy
I'm
looking.
way ahead of you. The autocomplete from Walmart CO came up cosplay right away, and
Oh, good.
yeah, wow. Okay, so that's an aspect of reality now. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
an aspect of God. People dressing up in Walmart.
Hell, everything is, isn't
Yeah,
it? Right. But
holy,
some are
holy stuff
more.
right there.
Okay, so let's continue our journey of
Yeah,
our individual soul I consciousness. Okay, so we're falling away from source being and going, who are we? What are we? Or who are we if we're not part of God? It seems like God's falling away. So it's a real soul fear because we register it even though it's not objective reality. We register it as such in personal reality. This is really
because we're emotive beings
interesting.
first. Because the soul is emotive. Hmm.
Exactly
Yeah.
right. It's a terror.
Hmm.
Now we go along. We're kind of falling away from source being, and the at some point there's a 360 turn. We're falling out on our backs, but just like children are in the head first. In the birth canal and come out head first, and it's not feet first. We turn around, and then we're looking where we're falling.
Oh, I never thought about that. They turn on the way
Yes.
out, right? Yeah.
Yeah. It depends. Yeah. There has to be this whole motion thing to get them out.
Hmm.
Even though they're upside down most of the time, they're right side up for a long time, and then they have to turn upside down.
Uh-huh.
So as we turn and start facing, we can feel the divine being, source being behind us. But now we're getting sort of, here I can start to self-identify with my experience going downward, outward, let's say, from source being. I can feel it on my back, but I'm starting to have experiences, and I like these experiences. I'm starting to feel edges around my soulful being. I'm going through ethers that reflect me to me in some way. That when you're all pre-born, pre-soul-born, you don't have edges of self-awareness. So self-awareness is deepening. We start to like our semi-unalistic, dualistic experience. And then a second terror forms. Oh, shit, I like this. I don't want to lose this. I like this. If source being, based on the earlier misinterpretation, ejected me, it could suck me back in too. This takes a little bit to really get next to, but it does explain why there's a terror of losing ourself in the way of what we would call the non-dual traditions of losing self.
Hmm.
So that's the simplest way. I can't make it any simpler than that. And you have to feel this rather than understand it fully in your head. But it's a turn. Then we start to like things that we're gravitating to our self-identification as a soul. We have an energy body of soul at that time, but we of course haven't fallen all the way to the denser dimensions yet. And finally, once we like, okay, so we can't feel that terror of not being. We have to sublimate, just like before we turn, we have to sublimate the terror of being, because we can't do anything about it. We're moving, we're falling, we're rising, however you want to frame it. You have to sublimate the terror, and when you sublimate the first soul terror of being, that's when you start to turn. And okay, I can't stop any of this, so I may as well see where I'm falling to, or there's some curiosity, or you turn and then now we got my experience rather than its experience. Is
Yeah, there's
another
a
way
lot
to say
going
it.
on there, and
There's a
you
lot
can't just
going
work it out. Yeah, just like birth
on.
trauma, right? It's not
Right,
going to get
right.
worked out in that hour, much less that minute.
So exactly, and so the more stuff that's going on and sticking to you in your own self-identified experience, at some point it gets so full that then there's the third fear that occurs. It's not logical in one way. The third soul fear is the terror of non-being, because we are starting to feel in that soulful attraction or magnetism of experience. Our will starts to open up to us. Our will, we can turn one way or another. We can look at something or not look at something, and all this experience that's coming at us in the ethers. And it occurs to us at some point that, well, now that I'm part of the ethers and the ethers are part of me, and I have will to engineer how I want to look. I can slow down a little bit now. Look, I can slow down, I can speed up. And then it occurs to us, again, not logically, that what if the will of source being, like we were afraid in the second soul fear, it might pull us back in for a total loss of our self-will. Here it becomes a modified form of it. And in that sense, the modified form is, how am I going to adjudicate? Will divine being's will overwhelm my self-will? How do I adjudicate my will with a divine being? Because you can't, as you're falling into experience, you can't help but then realize that, well, divine being is everywhere. But that's a later accrual of consciousness awareness than you had before the first one got sublimated. See.
Yeah,
So
while you're talking about this, I'm getting images of how toddlers are. Like if you were to give like a tricycle or something to a toddler, like they at a certain age they might be afraid of the new thing and be like clinging to the leg of a parent and be behind it. And
that's
then,
right.
it feels safe enough to go further from the parent and get on the thing, and maybe it's still afraid, but then it starts to like it. And then the parent might be like, okay, well, you're done now. It's time for dinner or whatever. And then the kid's like, no, I like this thing. I don't want to give it
Yeah.
up. And
Right.
like, there's a sort of corollary in terms of feeling texture there because, we're when we're born, I imagine we're quite young the ultimate, we're infant souls in a way. So
Yes.
we're going to be processing
Sure.
reality in a very impressionistic way.
That's exactly right, and we can go one step further in with that, Joseph. Great thought there about linking that experience, because that's where our experience actually comes from in this initial soul birth phase before we get all the way down to dense levels of reflection, self-reflection. That it's exactly that process. Well, we have a will, and you want to stay playing with your new toy, but mommy and daddy say, come down for dinner now, and you don't want to come down. And so is divine being, which parents are in that
Yeah.
metaphor, they're going to abrogate your will, and you don't have to like it. So
And
this
every
all
parent
comes
knows
from,
the stories of when their kid discovered the word no. It's like a very big moment that
there you
lasts
go.
months and months, and where they just say no to
That's
everything
right.
just to show that they can assert their own will. And where it seemed
Exactly.
like just yesterday they would do anything and didn't want to be apart from you, and everything was a yes, and then it suddenly changes. So it's an interesting
So
analogy.
absolutely. So, as you can see, how an infant from birth to toddler stage to the terrible twos, when no
Mm-hmm.
starts throwing tantrums
Mm-hmm.
in reaction, they all come out of this initial soul eye maturation from non soul eye to soul eye. And at the toddler stage, we have a third soul fear that comes. What if it's going to abrogate or overrule our will? So again, a perfect example of how what is it? Something recapitulates something. What's the phrase, Joseph? Oh God, I
That
used to use this all the
Yeah,
time.
yeah. The progeny, cosmogony. What was
Yes,
that?
yes, right, right. Uh, uh,
On
progeny, on,
ontogeny. Is that the word? Ontogeny.
progeny recapitulates ontology.
Ontog.
No, not ontology. Uh, in the way that
Yeah.
our yeah, okay,
Ontology
we'll
being
come
the essential beingness, and
right.
progeny the progenesis, the thing that follows, the
Exactly
growth of
right.
what
Yeah. So it
follows.
recapitulates it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and the example that there is when embryos form tails
Uh huh.
inside the womb and then get reabsorbed. So there it's recapitulating the ontology of the evolutionary process inside the womb. That's it. Okay, so now we've got this is a terror. I had no other good language to describe it, so it was the terror of non-being. It's sort of a non-being that your will and divine being's will, our parentage, may clash sometimes. And how do you have a being when you've got will, which is our second most essential nature, possibly clashes with the will of our parentage. So it's sort of a non-being. I couldn't find any other way, but it does sort of fit linguistically. A terror of being, a terror of not being in the second soul sphere, and a terror of non-being. It's good
It
enough symbolic.
non-being. I had a hard time relating to that phrase until I started to experience it, and I think it's a
Uh-huh.
great. I think it's a great word, non-being, because
Okay.
I experienced. I'm not done with any of this, of course, but I experienced a lot more of the. I moved through a lot more of the not being in
Uh-huh.
sagehood
In
before I got to
sagehood,
some of
right.
the non-being stuff, and the not being was hard, but the non-being makes the not
Oh.
being stuff look easy because
It's so sticky, isn't
it's
it?
very
It's
sticky.
just
Yeah, because in the
sticky.
not
Yeah.
being, it's like there's a surrender of just like, okay, well, maybe I'll just cease existing and that'll just be the end of it. But
Right.
non being is sort of like that, and then again, and then again, and again. You persist. It's a, in Zen, they say it's like 1,000 little deaths. But in one
Yes.
way, there's an overarching thing that's just about moving through the fear of death, and just
Right.
there's a sort of finality of letting go to that. Non-being doesn't let you off the hook. You know you're going to persist, and you
Yes.
lose your agency at the same time, which is it's way more
Oh,
confusing to navigate than ceasing to exist.
it's a great and another way to say what just exactly what you just brought out there is that sagehood is a wholesale
Yeah.
loss of self, and but it's an ongoing retail loss of self in sainthood, where we have to adjudicate our will with divine being in all moments, in every moment.
Yeah,
It's
like
just a
try
really
getting through your grocery list when any amount of
yeah.
fear of non-being is going on. To make it, do I want this? What I feel a wanting for this. I've never gotten this before. I got this
Right.
last time, and you can't locate your will. You have to find a new way of
Yes.
defining what your own will is.
Exactly. And here's another example of how, in this sense, what we've just done really. Another way to reflect on the meaning of this third soul fear is that it isn't God's will or the highway as it is in the three major religions. There's no adjudicate. There's no bartering or co-sharing of will in the big three. It's surrender, submission, Islam, submission, right? It's submission to the will of God in all three in varying degrees in varying situations. And here's another fundamental premise that's so easy to not appreciate about identity is
Yeah.
that we're saying that no, you are because we're products of divine being. We're downline versions of it in our own small billionth of a billionth of a billionth of a trillionth way. We still carry the same architecture of consciousness as divine being, and so in that sense, it isn't a submission to the will of God is not the answer. It was the answer in pre-psychological, pre-philosophical terms.
Mm-hmm.
But the Identity maintains that our sacred will is malleably resonant or not resonant with divine being. It's not submission. It's co-sharing. It's co-sharing. And divine being, since we're expressions of it, and it can only define itself by its expressional children, we have a huge impact on reflecting God back to God, because it can't get outside of itself to experience itself. So it's experiencing itself through the will of its children, including the Holocaust, including Attila the Hun, including Stalin, like we talked in the last podcast, all the negative archetypes.
Which for you guys was last week.
God.
I just still think that's funny. For us, it was yesterday.
Funny. So here's another beautiful principle hiding in plain sight, that there is no submission to Allah or to Yahweh or to Jesus in those three ways, the big three.
And I think it's useful and interesting to be able to underline how much easier it would be if it were just surrender. Now, of course, depending on where you are in your journey, the idea, there's 5 billion people doing a devotional religion in this world, working on to some degree or another, surrendering their not illusory, that would be East, but their flawed self, which is irreparable in some way, which is why it has to be thrown into a garbage heap and immolated so that you can surrender to, or saved, so you can surrender to entirely to the will of God. Now, there's difficulties associated with that, but we would offer that it's far more difficult to sort out the resonant will with God in you versus not resonant will with God in you with the will of God itself. It's way more moving parts and way more uncertainty, and there's no book of rules you can just follow.
That's right.
You find via process of elimination and often through suffering what is true and what is not. And you're the only authority left with that. It's between you and life, and that's really hard.
Yeah. Really nicely said, Joseph. Exactly. And if we put just one finer point on that, the soul I is far more commensurate with the will of God in one way than our human version, our protection. So all the difficulty comes between identifying what's soul I and what's our protector I, our human I. And so, but even the soul, but paradoxically, the soul I can choose for itself its own value systems that may or may not 100% correlate to the will of God. And the will of God, divine being says, have at it. Show me what is possible here. Take my experience of the human condition to another degree I haven't seen yet, or we haven't seen yet, right? So
it's a continuum. There's many gray areas along the way.
Yeah, you have to. Identity rests on the principle that you've got to get comfortable with ambiguity, because your brain is not going to track all of these kinds of experiences. It has to be with your essential heart, the heart of soul. So if you're looking at the chart that's Joseph's kindly put on here on the video here, all we did up until all this time is the first 3 lines. Okay, that's all we've talked about. The 3 unconscious terrors of soul birth.
The top row, as it were. Yeah.
The top row, the top 3. And so we want to focus down and break it down a little more clearly. That there's 3 dharmas to address the 3 essential soul fears, the unconscious terrors of being, not being, and non-being. Emotional body ensoulment dharma, which is we call personhood, heals the terrors of being. Mental body ensoulment heals the terror of not being. We'll come back to that in a moment. And it's willful body ensoulment that heals the terrors of non-being, just as we've been saying, adjudicating the will of divine being with our will. It's important to get a lot of burps happen for a lot of non-dualists with, mental body ensoulment? Why would you choose the term mental body when the mental body is an illusion?
Ah,
Well, you see,
I want to scream. I want to scream.
exactly.
The mental body is an illusion. So when you add like two
Yeah,
chickens plus two ducks, that's like
yeah,
that. Adding that up, that's illusory. I get what they mean, but it's like there's just
yeah.
so observably an inherent mental body processing thing as part of reality. The mind is.
Yes,
The illusion is that it's you, right?
yes,
That's the illusion.
exactly. And all the identity would say about that is it's the over attachment to our mental body that's the problem, not the essential nature or existence of the mental body as an illusion is the problem. In other words, this is a really another important point that it's our over attachment and over identification with the mental body. I think, therefore I am, even though that's not even a good interpretation of what's his name's
Descartes.
orientation.
Yeah.
Yeah, Descartes. It's the over attachment that's a problem, not the essential illusory nature of it. And that's where we part ways with the esoteric East on enlightenment. So you ensoul the mental body. I have bad news for non-dualists. You'll realize this once you die and you don't disappear, but you have a mental body as part of your soul eye. In between lifetimes, you make discernments and distinctions between paths of consciousness very clearly. We have a mental body. The brain doesn't create the mental body. The mental body or the brain susses or precipitates out of the mental body of the soul. So another here is really important distinction that the language must reflect as much as possible. It's an abstraction. All language is an abstraction, but I spent years trying to adjudicate the actual words we use to abstract what we're trying to talk about that don't fight or dissonate with the actual reality we're trying to describe.
As an illustration of that, I'm curious what you would say about because the evolution of identity is always interesting. In 1.0, the third soul fear was about etheric body
Yes. Yes.
enlightenments, right? It was the three enlightenments.
Yes. Three
So,
enlightenments,
you
right?
want to say a few words about how it moved from etheric body enlightenment to willful body ensoulment? Because that's an interesting refinement,
Yeah.
which includes etheric body enlightenment, which is a really
It
good example
does.
of how it evolves in a non-contradictory way, but still
Oh,
evolves.
thanks for bringing that up. I
Yeah.
completely forgot about that. I had no other language at the time because I hadn't experienced it yet. If you get that, again, this I have to be more personal here. I was born actively conscious of the divine being within which I precipitated out of. That was a reality for me. I didn't have to learn that. So it was so seamless for me that I exist and divine being exists, and I precipitate out of and live within the presence of divine being at all moments. The best I could describe the soul fear is that it was an etheric, our soul is etheric, that it had to find its way to learn how to be a human in this most dense universe. So I hadn't yet experienced any distinction between my soul I, quote unquote, will and divine being's will. I was just on a ride that I had I had a bit of power to choose how I wanted to ride the ride.
And that was
That
prior to
was all.
2013 when will was still very much rewarded rather than being
Exactly.
pulled out of us
Exactly.
osmotically like it is these days.
And actually, the anticipation of that, it actually moved from etheric body to willful body because it was the next level down. I started to experience as the sun of the yang god started to set in 2010. I started to feel it set. It sharpened everything for me. It went from etheric body to an aspect of the etheric body, our will.
I
So
remember that.
that became my experience, which I couldn't have had until the sun started to set and the moon started to rise in 2012, which was a gradual 2 to 3 years continuum for me. So that's when it changed between 2009 and 2012 to willful body. It got clearer, closer to 2012, I think. I don't remember exactly, but that's my answer to your question.
And
And
it's
it
also,
evolves. Yeah.
yeah, it also lights up for me. Like when I meet, I know some professional psychics here and there who are not doing EBE. They're quite willful with their etheric body. And
Yes.
so those are different things. You can be using your psychic gifts in a very willful way. So
Yes.
that can be awake in someone, but that doesn't mean they've healed their sainthood fear.
Oh, thank you. That's a great point to remember here. We're looking at a healing a terror of non-being, which is another whole, as we just spent a long time describing, a retail version of every moment that can't be put into boxes so easily as the wholesale version of sagehood, right? So, in that sense, what we've got now, we just did the second row, the first of this.
So I was
We've
sure
got
you were going to do one hood at a time. This is a really interesting way of doing it, doing the rows instead of the columns this way.
But now we will do that.
Okay.
The top. I see the top as a roof like this, and now
Sure.
we'll go down the floors. So the three dharmas of personhood, sagehood, and sainthood format out of healing the terrors of being, not being, and non-being. So we always suggest, even though people may show up, like we talked last time, how do they show up? Sometimes people show up enlightened and before they do personhood, or much more kundalini'd in some ways in sainthood. So we take everyone individually. Everyone Edenity offers. We all have to do all three of these dharmas one day to ever make peace with our soul as a human being. That's another way to say this. So we don't expect everyone to do this in one lifetime, obviously, but we'll get to that in a moment. So personhood, healing the terrors of being. The good way to headline. Here's some headlines. Decondition and recondition familial and cultural situational-based wounds and their addictions and identifications. In other words, this is where our protector is born very early on, sometimes in the womb, in my case, in many people's cases, where we have to decondition and recondition our family dynamics because we had to come out of our family, and that is not so dissonant with how we came out of divine being. And so we have to decondition the wound basis of our parents who did not go through EBE before they had us. So they were still conditioned by their familial and cultural conditionings, and was a rare parent who could get outside of and think paradigmatically that their parents' reality that we all absorbed is not the reality. In fact, it's not only not the reality, what we got conditioned as, it's a twisted form of reality that sort of strangles our soul eyes identity into a protector. Another way to say that.
And the better you thought your childhood was, the more of a shock and awe that process is. By the way, did you know
amen.
A fetus can cry?
Yes.
I had no idea.
I learned that recently.
Yeah, I saw this video of it was a sonogram of a fetus crying. It was heartbreaking to see. Like, oh my God.
I read a physiologist once just explained that as moisture being forced out by the cells getting tighter and tighter. And
it didn't look like it. The mouth was open. I mean, you could feel the pain of this in this video. Oof, it really made that the potential wounding, in utero wounding, seem very hauntingly real. Like that's a being in there feeling what's going on.
That's the soul of the fetus, which is way bigger than the consciousness of the fetus, and it's oozing out through the fetal flesh of its precipitation, right? So your parents were full of familial and cultural-based wounds and their addictions and identifications, all the while they're defending it as the reality mostly. And so what we try to do is help you make a distinction between your conditioning truths of reality and from your parents and your cultures and your religious conditionings. So you discover and then heal away over time the inauthentic protector self that is the repository that came out of fighting our parents' reality in some way because it didn't allow our souls to breathe. So our protector protected ourselves. That didn't fight the parents. It just compressed itself smaller into our protector self because those choke our soul fields. Not mostly in the less dense arc of the soul species. Terrans don't experience that much dissonance in their early lifetimes between their parents' reality and their reality, and they don't identify wound bases. They're still getting their feet wet and their feet dirty in the earth. So in EBE, we discover and heal away our inauthentic protector self that thinks it's us, and recover and inhabit our lost, emotively authentic soul version of self. I could say soul version here. And emotively authentic in our jargon is soulful. Is a soul. Emotively authentic is our soul I, as opposed to our conditioned and smaller protector self I. That way. So once we do that, the process could be called. The whole process of personhood could be called self to soul authentication. Mm-hmm. Self to soul. Self transmutes into the soul I. The self I, which is our inauthentic protector, evolves into our proactively in EBE to our soul I.
And that's the realer surrender dynamic rather than devotional spirituality. And I wanted to say before, like, I wonder how many people, and especially teachers, when they think they're accessing the will of God, they're actually talking to their own soul.
Yes.
And that's how rare their access to their own soul is.
Oh, nicely. Oh, I never put that together. That's exactly right, Joseph.
You know,
That's
when people
exactly
talk about
right.
their higher self or something, like, we don't want to access the higher self or that voice. We want to become it.
We want to become it, not raise our vibrations to it. Become it.
Or be able to tap into it occasionally. You know, we want to be that and have there be nothing else beside that. It's a far higher bar.
You bet. And if we go one step more meta in describing that self to soul transmutation, we're risking to real eyes. Mm-hmm. We take big risks, and our life changes so radically when we move from our protector self to our soul self. It's hugely risky. You're jumping off cliffs like lemmings don't, by the way. Your lemmings don't crowd and jump off the cliff, by the way.
We've been getting a lot of emails from lemmings wanting us to correct that
clarify
record.
that.
So,
yes, absolutely. They don't want to be seen as suicidal anymore. So we're risking... yeah. We're risking to realize because our soul I is our protector I is real, but our soul I is more real.
And one of the most common expressions of that happens for people usually fairly early on, maybe one of the first benchmarks, is when people start to clean up some of their basic conditioned patterns, especially caretaking and other relational unhealthy dynamics that are very well rewarded in our society, enabling behaviors and whatnot. And when people start to see that and experience that and want to pull it back, there's often a fear moment of like, well, if I do this, like, am I going to be completely alone? Am I ever going to have a mate if they're single?
Right.
And that's how you know it's working. Unfortunately, when you start to really see how toxic most forms of relationality are in the world, and it is a risk to raise the bar and say, well, I'm going to, change the way I relate or spend less time with these people who, I've talked to a number of people who, when they quit drinking, lose their friends who are their drinking buddies. Right?
Absolutely.
Like, there was no relationship there. Well, there was some, but there was not much relating there to begin with. And we even have this expression, finding out who your real friends are. I think I heard Louis C.K. make a joke about that. He's like, you don't want to find out who your real friends are. Your real friends are boring. It's the fake friends that are really fun. He was joking about.
That's right. Oh, God.
So there are real risks there associated with it, and that's why usually you have to be near the end of your proverbial rope in order to be willing to take such risks.
Yeah, you're jumping off cliffs constantly in those final phases of risking. Well, and that's why it's called the terrors of being.
Mm-hmm.
Your new being is emergent that hasn't emerged before, your soul I, and that changes all the values associated with fulfillment, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you've got to risk losing all the safer ones to find the realer
But
ones.
to me, and then that's where personhood runs right into sainthood, because it's like, how could you be not rewarded for being the truest you there is, which is an aspect of the divine? Like,
Right.
that's what I will often tell people. It's like, okay, so
Yeah.
let's say, you take these risks and you become that much more you. Do you expect to be penalized by life for that? Are you going to like lose your job and be forever alone? Is that more likely than drawing people you actually resonate with more? And,
Right.
that's what tends to happen. But, of course, believing in that doesn't really help a whole lot.
No, no, you've got to experience the magic that comes in soulizing.
Mm-hmm.
That you actually won't become homeless. You won't be alone. You won't be broke and in debtor's prison like the old days. So it does run. It does bump right against that. But we're not really ready to celebrate that unseparability from spirit quite yet. If we want to do the whole enchilada, you want to heal all three soul fears. So mental body ensoulment is healing the terrors of not being, and the headlines there are de-dualizing the mental body and ending its rulership of experience in all aspects of your everyday life.
That is so hard to get across to people, that they're
I
processing
know.
reality through their mind. How do you
Yes.
get that across to people?
It's almost impossible unless they have non-dual enlightenment in their past, in
Yeah,
their
yeah.
past lives. But if they don't, it's so de rigueur, it's so default in the modern day that your you-ness is wholly experienced through a mental body algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
Even emotions in that picture have been defined for us, conditioned into us as part of the mind. They're even part of the brain, don't you know? They're in the amygdala
Well, that's,
area.
yes, it's the domain of emotional intelligence, which is a phrase I
Oh,
gag on every time I hear
oh,
it.
I gag and I want to go la 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 la. Right. So it is there's only one way to end the rulership of the mental body. You can't transcend it. You have to end it temporarily, make it a blank slate. And the only tradition that did that the cleanest for me, just in my particular soul aspections, was the Zen, the most torturous form of notness, pure Zen. What's the metaphor we use for it, Joseph?
The car
My
one?
version of the
We got
sorry
to do
what?
the car metaphor. The trading in your crappy
Um,
car for the nice car and then driving it into the pond, that one at some point.
uh,
But you're thinking of.
you, and for EBE, you turn your old time Volkswagen Bug into a Maserati or a Rolls Royce or a Bentley,
Yes,
and then
Bentley.
you're asked in sagehood to drive it into the lake and find that the end of the car metaphor, the end of the shape and form and expression, the form and expression isn't you. And you find out after it sinks into the water, you can lose the car, but you can swim up to the surface. And that's what happens. There's not the end of you; it's just the end of the mental body rulership of it, of your consciousness, not the end of you, which Zen scorched earth. That's the
Oh yeah,
scorched earth.
Scorcher's Zen. And then you find that the car was actually keeping you out of life in a significant way. You weren't actually in life.
Exactly.
You were inside a car in life, inside a box in
Exactly.
life.
So even if you're driving in personhood, if it were separable in this way, driving in personhood, you're upgrading your mental body from a Volkswagen Bug from the '60s to a current model of a Bentley. It's still your mental body is ruling you until you realize how much it has been and you haven't been aware of it.
And there's
And
another
so,
key twist on that metaphor, and that is how easy it is if you do sagehood first. it's very
Oh, yes.
easy to drive your, for me, my first
Yes.
car was a 19, what was it? 85? Was it an 85? I think it was. It was a 1985 Ford Escort. With a rusted suspension. It lasted only like 4,000 miles. It was like a $1,200 car. And when you have a $1,200 Ford Escort, it's very easy to drive that into the lake. And that's what is going on when very depressed people are drawn to
Yes.
sagehood. It's
Yes.
if you, in some significant way, don't want to live,
Yes.
facing the fear of not being is you do it inside a kind of depression medication thing, and you won't work all of it, because how can you work all of your fear of not being if the you're operating with largely doesn't want to be anyway?
Exactly. Oh, well
You don't have
said.
much to lose, right? So you're not going to find that fear.
So another way to say what Joseph is saying here is that you're not going to be drawn to ending your identity as palpable and real unless in the background unconscious you're existentially depressed. You're just not going to be drawn to that. Joyful people don't tend to get drawn to Zen, and that's why they're so zombie-like in so many ways. How lifeless they are. They transmuted in one way, transformed their depression into an enlightened state, but they don't have any aliveness. At least Advaita Vedanta, in the Hindu softer versions of enlightenment, they have a little more aliveness to them, color, and instead of the pure Zen stuff. So that question you just asked took us a little while to unpack. How many people get that their whole identity is mediated through the algorithm of mental body? Dualistic life. This is not that. This can't be that and be itself. A bolt of lightning is not the same as a celery stalk I'm having with lunch with peanut butter. Peanut butter and celery? Oh man, it's great.
It's a classic.
Okay, so the next level down of a headline is liberating the root of soul to baseline all downline aspects of our personal life. In other words, if the disease is not of being duped by an illusion, but the disease is an over-attachment to an identity that processes life dualistically. I'll say that once more. It's about over-attachment to processing life dualistically, including a separate you, separate from everything else. So when we say liberating the root of soul to baseline, in other words, horizontalize everything. Nothing is better than anything else. Based to the baseline, a root of identity is not in the mental body. It's in the fourth chakra, in the soul body. So that changes all sorts of our attachments and identifications with personal life. You just
And if your pursuit of happiness didn't already crash and burn in personhood, the rest of it does there. Because
retail and wholesale.
Yes, because
exactly.
that's where there's no more joy or contentment in content. It's just gone.
Yeah, that was the first symptom that I realized after my non-dual event was that happiness or sorrow had no tall buildings or short buildings. Everything is all leveled to the same level. In personhood, you vacate a building. You don't no longer want to live there in the conditioned building of your childhood.
Nice.
But the building's still there. Here, at the wholesale level, the buildings all become one height. Nothing is better or worse than anything else. And this really changes your reactivities to everything. Everything is equally meaningful or equally non-meaningful. In a really personal way, it's murder to try to integrate the two later, which you have to learn how to do. So in that sense, you shed existential level attachments and identifications to all manner of personal selfhood. That's what happens in enlightenment, non-dual enlightenment, pre-dual enlightenment and identity. And that, instead of being a self-to-soul authentication, it's a soul-to-soul authentication. Your soul is embracing its nature as true baseline nature, as non-mental.
Oh, because it like self to soul is, you could also say that as content to context authentication,
Yes,
personality
content to
to
context.
soul
Right,
connection.
right.
And this
Right.
is context to context, because it's
Yes,
you see through all content of that which is behind all things, and are no
exactly.
longer duped by any dualistic, cosplay, to go back to our Walmart thing at the beginning.
Nice. Yeah, exactly right. Thanks for saying it that way. When I made that word-based abstraction, I could feel what you just said, but I didn't have those words in it. I could
Hmm.
feel exactly what you said. It's context to context, but I didn't have
It's
that in
also
my
like another
head.
way of saying it is context as content.
Context as content. Yes. Oh, that's beautiful. Yes,
And
another
this is
way of
where
saying it.
neo-Buddhistic paradigms will talk about things like, this world is an illusion. That's what they're trying to get at, but
Yeah,
throwing the baby out with
it's
the bathwater and using sloppy metaphysics. They're wanting you to see that which is behind all things as just as realer in a way, because in one way it is, but we would say in another way it's just as real. It's just
yeah.
further upstream.
Upstream to downstream, exactly. Not either or. Upstream to downstream makes an and. Not in a real sense. It's both are true, and some are more real than
And
others, deeper.
And speaking of risking to realize, that happens here too, although it's sort of like happens, I don't know, it's more of a wholesale or contextual kind of thing, because when this happens, it changes the way you relate with people significantly, because people are
Yeah,
so content focused who haven't done
yeah,
sagehood work, and it
right.
can feel very claustrophobic and kind of aggravating how small and it just, yeah, like I've been I had a little bit of a soapbox I wanted to go on. I don't know if I still have it, but I was imagining before we went on air today, as we get closer to the election, the people who have chosen a side, whether it's Republican or Democrat, I'm noticing the tendency to overly glorify their choice. Even people who are libertarians largely,
Mm-hmm.
I know I have a friend who's a libertarian and is falling prey to fake news that favors the candidate she's chosen to
Yes. Mm-hmm.
vote for. And
Mm-hmm.
it hurts me and confuses me. It's sort of like, okay, wait, who you identify with someone who supports neither, but you've chosen who you're going to vote for, and now you're falling prey to that conditioning on that side. And I want to say, like, it's fine who you're voting for, but why are you falling prey to that illusion that they're actually good? Because
Yeah.
neither of them are, there is one that
Yeah.
is worse, but
Yeah.
and it's like that claustrophobia I feel of like, oh God, can you just like make a choice without having to create this illusory
Yeah.
loyalty crap as if
Yeah.
all of the crap isn't there, and that it really bothers me.
Well, I can tell you. Oh, I love that. I love that you brought in the word loyalty, because with my Italian mafia flavored childhood, loyalty takes the place of truth and clarity.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah,
you don't have to justify any of your positions. Just be loyal.
yeah,
And I realized at an early age that look through the mafia stuff, omerta, the silence. You're loyal to the thing.
hmm,
Um, uh, Loyalty is a piss poor substitute for real knowledge and real truth and real metaphysical clarity.
yeah.
And so anytime someone says loyalty, I'm out the door. That's it.
And
You
so I don't think
paradigmatic
we've ever
thinker.
talked about this. It's so funny because I hated the concept of loyalty since I was as long as I
Yep.
can remember. And when
Yeah.
I coach businesses and I'll say like, so why should these customers stay with you? Who've been working, and they're like, well, brand loyalty. I'm like, no, like that will not be your reason. We're throwing that
No.
out right now. Do not bank on that, especially
You,
nowadays. It used to actually be
yeah.
something. Now it doesn't work
Yeah.
at all.
No, you've got to constantly re-up what works. What product or service can you count on now? Not
Yeah.
what you used to buy in the past. So that's called evolution, folks.
Yeah.
Evolution.
It's reminds me,
Okay.
I had this, I think I mentioned this once on a podcast where I had this disagreement with a colleague of mine, And in my picture, of course, his wife was clearly wrong about something, and there was a back and forth on some social media platform about it. And I talked to him because I wanted to work it out. And at one point he said, well, of course I'm going to take her side because she's my wife.
We can't go down this rabbit hole anymore here. I get it. Oh, yes, God, yes.
That's all I need to say about it. That's loyalty.
Alrighty. Thank you, Mr. That was good soapboxing. That was actually applicable to sagehood.
Okay, good.
I loved it. You bridged to that. But the last thing here, it's not. I get what you mean by there's a risking, realizing kind of thing, but this is now wholesale.
Yeah.
You literally die to live. Mm-hmm. You die. Your old version of self with its over-attachment to mental body dualistic mosaicing of life dies. And a new thing, a new soul expansiveness arises. And it's that new soul expansiveness, actually non-dual enlightenment, liberates the soul wholesale to no longer be slave to the dualistic smallness that life attached itself to before. And that's the segue right to sainthood.
Yeah.
Here, the biggest, the most cosmic headline is realization of our eternal structural connection to divine being through the love of which we are made. In other words, we're not made of mental constructs, folks. We're not made of energy. Love is not an energy. Energy is a form of love once love starts moving and expressing in form and expression. But there is a stillful, what I'm tending to call it now is ikoria. Ichor of the gods, the blood of the gods from the Old Norse thing. Ikoria in the yin phase now, it's much more yin. There is a stillness of love of which we're made that is not energy, it's pre-energy, just before energy forms and expresses. And that's a stillful thing that you can learn to feel that vibrates so fast it's still. Remember that Robin Williams' last podcast, What Dreams May Come? That
thank
was the
you.
movie.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Underrated.
But the divine being vibrates so fast it looks still, just like another movie where Robin Williams played the doctor who realized that a certain malady of the body of stiffness is actually vibrating.
Patients, that one. Yeah.
They're actually vibrating so fast they look still and they can't move. And he realized that L-Dopa, which treats Parkinson's, actually loosened up these folks temporarily. An amazing movie. So Ikoria is not energy. Energy is a form and expression of Ikoria, of the love of which you're made. We learn to share our willful authority for our life with the will of divine being because it wants to evolve and learn about itself through us.
I want to go back to the first one, the realization of our eternal structural connection. That is not possible without deconditioning your familial wounds because of the authority projections otherwise that will go onto divinity. And you can't experience the love that all things are made of while you're still processing reality through the mental body, which is what sagehood does. That's why we see sainthood as the third phase.
Yes. You can't do sainthood till you've cleared projections from wounds of childhood first, and then secondly, how you process your whole consciousness through your mental body.
And there's another piece too in personhood. I would say from my own experience, I actually had quite an aversion to real love that I was not aware of in personhood. I had an affinity for energy, but because of my mother invasive conditioning, love felt icky to me. So you can't experience God's love, which is a lot bigger than a person's love. If you've experienced that as invasive and icky, because it's coming from outside into you and from inside into the rest of you, it is, So you have to minimally make peace with that. I still have that icky thing sometimes, but I think it's more discerning icky than triggered icky
than the past.
than
Oh,
the
that's a good
past.
way to put it. Discerning ick rather than
Because there's such a thing as real ick.
yeah,
So
yeah. There really is ick. Yeah. So as you come to realize this, it's through actually opening of third eye realities of being that aren't dualistically configured. You gestalt things in third eye with third eye access. You feel there's impression. It's all impression. You move from an architectural blueprint form of consciousness after you enlighten to a Monet painting of consciousness. You define Monet's. It wasn't shapes that defined his painting. It was colors, and the colors made their own gradations of the shapings,
oh,
as
nice.
opposed to how painting was done before, in some way before Impressionism. So you need third eye for that, and that's what opens with this largesse of icoria as it begins to flow and ooze through you. It automatically opens 2, 4, and 6, creativity and generativity, and 2, love for self and all things, and 4, and the magnanimity of the reality of divinity, seamless. All those wake up in sainthood. And in this case, you don't authenticate self to soul like you did in personhood, or even soul to soul in sagehood, but soul to divine being authentication. You literally experience your authentic relational space in conjunction with divine being. It's a with. You're with divine being. You don't love divine being as an object. It doesn't love you as an object. It's a
Because you're not separate.
co-created, right? It's a co-created withness, and that permeates your whole soul field once you and soul in sainthood. And so I was born with a pretty good version of sainthood already inculcated in me. I must have dialed that in and from other lifetimes, but I had to add sage, and also I had sagely inheritances from other life, but I'd never done personhood because all of us, like we said in our last podcast, all of our past lives were in pre-psychological eras of human consciousness. So we never had a chance to really heal from the inside in personally. So we authenticate our relationship to divine being, and our bottom line summary is: you don't risk to realize or die to live. You serve to love, or love to serve. You can turn it either way. But to me, we exist to love. We serve the love. Love doesn't.
Not
It
people.
defines us. Not people.
Serving love. Yeah.
In the marriage vows that I help people write when I used to do weddings, my last words to them is serve the love that you feel for the other person. It's just a short unpacking.
Mm-hmm.
Don't essentially love the person. Don't serve the person. Oh, I got to agree with my wife because she's my wife, right?
That's serving the person.
You serve the love that you feel with the person, not for the person. And this is how a saintly person can transmute their whole way of doing love personally. It goes from a loving, I feel love for you, to I feel love with you. You need sainthood to be able to actually realize that difference between for and with. And you can't do that till you lose the mental body, like Joseph said.
And the flip side of for is also from. That love, we would say, it's not about pouring love on someone or being on the receiving end of that pouring. That's not what the deepest forms of love actually do.
I need more love from you.
Yeah.
No.
You needed more love from your parents or with your parents.
Exactly right. So serve to love is the bottom line that happens in a willful body ensoulment. Now, again, it is possible now to do all these in one lifetime. It's rare, but a lot of souls are ready to do that, especially with yin divinity raising all boats of a new kind of non-toxic collective consciousness. It's not not the toxicity of collectivism. It's the unalism of all equalities across the board. But if you do it, the goal here, one day, one life, soon, and it'll be easier the longer Maima or Divine Yin saturates earth and consciousness. If you do each of these dharmas in one lifetime, you heal all your soul fears that animated and expressed and formed all your past lives. And by doing it in one lifetime, you literally, it's possible to have the direct experience of, like from the first one, self as soul, matter as spirit, and earth as heaven in all moments. So if you think, whatever your prior paradigms have been, that you're ready to have your last incarnation here and you'll never have to come back, you have to qualify with that second to the last line. Are you you have the direct experience of yourself as soul, matter as spirit, just a precipitation of spirit, and earth as heaven in all moments? I'm sure as hell not there. But every year of my life, I get a little closer to it, and like Zeno's paradox. But a couple of layers further in is a huge difference than a couple. It's geometric. It's not arithmetic. This progression.
How many lifetimes of trying to do all three of these at the same time do you think is necessary to make some significant headway into that? Can it really be done in one, or is it more like 3 to 5 kind of thing? Like, because most people.
I think if you
go ahead, sorry.
Well, no, Joe, you're saying it exactly the same way. You need 3 or 5 half versions, then 2/3 versions to have one lifetime where it's all in one lifetime. So you have to have experience of first one, then another, then another. Then you have, I can do 2 in one life. Then I can do 3 in one life. But then you have to keep doing it until you can do it all in one life. So it's all
because
progressive.
I know, like with Zen enlightenments, I'm facile enough in reading past lives that I see most people who've been drawn to Zen, it looks like they're enlightened 4 or 5, 6, sometimes even like 8 or 9 times. Like that's not that hard to see. Yes, as a man, as a woman. Yes, sometimes they're stuck in emptiness. Sometimes they had a crazy enlightenment. So I would imagine those kinds of things would apply also. Like you definitely would have to do this as a man, as a woman. It's a very different experience in Edenity. Exactly. That alone would warrant a few passes. Exactly.
So I'm not saying that I've had enough of all three, since this is the first one I've ever been able to do personhood. So it can't be a complete one, however close I might get to it this lifetime as the founder of the actual Dharma to get there. I'm actually lagging in some ways because I have an advantage and I have a disadvantage both. Yeah. So I'm not saying this is going to be my most complete all three at one time, but I'm edging closer to it as we speak. So in this sense, even if you finally one day, one lifetime, do all three in the most complete ways possible, it's never done. You may be ready, you might be in that moment, you don't have to come back in incarnation anymore, but all of a sudden, we can use a metaphor from Buddhism, you're a bodhisattva, and a bodhisattva wants to, out of love, to keep coming to earth to help the world. None of us are ensouled all the way until all of us are ensouled in a big collective picture. So in this sense, we've modified it again, this least last one here. We used to call this enheartenment, which is a great term. It's a great term. We can still use that occasionally, but when Bree and I got together and decided on Edenity, it's Edenic consciousness because it's earth as heaven, not heaven on earth, not utopia, but you experience this crazy world doesn't have to be utopian to be heaven. It's you live and breathe all the smoke and the toxic fumes, and still it's earth as heaven. You don't fractionate your consciousness per moment of experience.
And I would add, you don't have to arrive at some finish line to have that experience.
Yes.
Which is both great and also kind of torturous, because I've had that experience hours or days and here and there weeks, and then the next level of or layers of stuff come up to be able to be worked, and you go, oh man, what happened to that thing from before? And but your more enlightened mind says that past doesn't exist anymore, bud, keep going.
Exactly. And here to kind of close on how you brought the first thing, what's the reality? We just did these 2 days in a row, but they're a week apart for everyone else.
Yeah.
I can hear somebody already saying, I think this is my third eye, why the hell didn't you start your first podcast with this picture?
I was gonna say for a few minutes, this was a really good introduction to Edenity that we did today. It only took 102 episodes to get there.
So
103.
I want to name that you got situationally rubber meets the road stuff in these podcasts of 102 different topics that all interrelate. They all relate to each other without dissonating. And here, I think there's some fitting. It's fitting that you get the overall schema after you've had the tastes and experience of it in the last 101 podcasts. So you're welcome to take a screenshot for this when it's on, if you're watching it on YouTube. I can't stop you anyway, so it is copyrighted. Please don't steal it. But this takes a lot of feeling into. Keep looking at this, and it will become more and more real and add some sort of aha to everything we've talked about in the previous podcasts. So,
cool. Yeah, so we get to introduce on the 103rd episode. 103 is a cool number.
It is.
Yeah. All right. I still want to go now. What my request would be is that in the following podcast, we zoom into each one of these hoods and break out like the next level down benchmarks. Like, what are the 10 benchmarks in personhood? I think in Sagehood we've talked about isness, allness, and notness before, but maybe revisit it with a little more granularity. And I'm pretty sure we've not done the sort of stages on the way to sainthood, which might be difficult to do given that it seems to be emergent these days from having done the first two hoods. So what the hell? How do you predict what's going to happen?
Exactly right. And it's so idiosyncratic.
Yeah.
But I loved your term granularity. We just densified a little more in the specificities of what these headlines mean. So let's do that next time.
Cool.
So we'll have this up also as reference in our next podcast then. But this is like the icing on the cake that's also the cake. But it's the most downline version of it, the one you taste first in some ways, but is also part of the whole mix. So okay.
Thank you, Stace. This is wonderful. I can't believe we threw this together. Well, you mostly threw it together. The idea came together with like T-. We almost didn't do this podcast, but such is how things are these days.
Yeah. I got to go with the divine inspiration here on that, because I was really I couldn't get one to bubble up, and because this was the one we were supposed to do, and that hadn't arisen in my consciousness yet. But I happened to accidentally come across it about 20 minutes ago and went, wait, we never did this. So,
cool.
Bada bing.
Cool. Thank you, Stace.
Okay,
Thank you, listeners.
You're welcome.
And whatever you're doing, keep going.
Good
Unless
one.
you don't want to,
All
in
right.
which case you should stop immediately. Thank you.
Nice.
And we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening. Bye for now. Thanks for listening to the Heart of Soul podcast. To learn more about Stace Barron and Edenity, please visit edenity.org. To learn more about Joseph Shapiro, visit clearandopen.com. Until next time, we wish you well on your journey.